Hello and welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 44, brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear. Today, John and I are talking the big woods of the Northeast and the quest for the Maine 200-pound patch with Neil Pendleton. So stay tuned. All right, Happy New Year, everybody. That was terrible. It's like my mouth didn't want to work this morning. But Happy New Year, everybody. I hope everyone's enjoying the cold weather that we have here across most of the Northeast and the Midwest. Speaking of enjoyment, one thing that you can enjoy, whether it's cold or hot, is a free Exodus Lift 2 trail camera. And all you have to do is head over to thetruthfromthestand.com, go to the About page, and sign up for our newsletter, and you will be entered into the drawing to win a free Exodus Lift 2 camera. So don't delay. Go ahead and do that as soon as we hit the 200 mark for folks who have registered. We will go ahead and do the drawing, get the camera out to the lucky winner. We'll announce it on Facebook, and we'll get a hold of you and get your shipping address and your information and get that into your hands. Super excited here for the 2018 year. We have some new partners coming on, so really looking forward to being able to do some giveaways from some new partners. So some of the new folks we're going to be working with in 2018 is Wicked Tree Gear, which you heard probably in the intro, and then also Glacier Coolers are two of the new folks who have come on board. And we've got some stuff in the works here for, as we move further into 2018 that I can't quite announce yet, but we will here in the coming episodes announce a few other folks who have joined the team here, so to speak. With that, this podcast is brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear, the longest lasting, fastest cutting, toughest tree trimming equipment you have ever used. Simply put, the toughest saw on earth. Right now, when you visit wickedtreegear.com, use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and get a 20% discount on your Wicked purchase. This podcast is also brought to you by Exodus Outdoor Gear. Life's a passion. Pursue it. You've heard me talk about these guys forever. They have a kick-ass camera, and now they're launching the new Exodus Trek. And this is coming in at under a $150 price point, so a little less expensive than their original Lift and Lift 2. Visit ExodusOutdoorGear.com to pre-order this new camera today and use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and save $20. We're also brought to you by Whitetail Institute of North America. Research equals results. It's that time of year, folks. Start planning for next year's plots. Visit whitetailinstitute.com and pick up your soil test kit to begin planning for next year's food plot success. And also Glacier Coolers, simply the world's finest. Whether you're hunting, camping, or fishing, you'll enjoy smarter designs, stronger construction, and superior insulation of Glacier Coolers. Visit them at glaciercoolers.com. So as you heard, there's a couple of new folks in the mix here. We're going to try to do some giveaways here in the not so distant future with some of those and get those products into your hands. Really looking forward to the 2018 year. And kind of closing the chapter here. I did a hunt this past weekend, had a little bit of time off over the holiday, and got out in some of the frigid temperatures. Saw a couple deer, nothing within shooting range, but all in all, the year's been successful. We'll do a recap of our 2017 season here at some point, but just feel really fortunate to be able to have been out in the woods as much as I have been this year, with the trip to Montana and the trip to Ohio and getting out here around my home on some public land and harvesting a great Pennsylvania 8-point this year with my bow. You couldn't be more pleased with the season that I had. I actually recently got my Ohio buck back from last year, the mount finish. So super excited to hang that in the house. I'm just trying to wrangle some wall space from my wife in the living room. Fingers crossed. We'll see if that happens. But looking forward to what 2018 has to bring. And first up, we have Neil Pendleton today that John and I are talking to. And Neil comes from the Northeast, and we're talking big woods hunting. What's interesting about Neil is he and I kind of struck up a relationship over social media in advance of this conversation, probably roughly a year and a half ago. And, he predominantly hunts the Northeast, but he does take some trips, into the Midwest, specifically Ohio, and does some hunting. So it was really interesting to get his perspective on hunting the big woods in the Northeast, New Hampshire and Maine, and then also, kind of positioning that against his experiences in the Midwest, Ohio specifically. What kind of struck me as interesting was when we were talking, he was talking about the 100-pound or the 200-pound patch. And I'll let him kind of explain it as we get into the podcast, but it was just a different way of looking at the maturity of a deer and creating a target buck or a target deer list, if you will. So it was much different than what I had heard previously. I'd never heard that term, the 200-pound patch, before. And so we kind of dive into that with Neil, and he explains that and kind of goes through the hunt. It's been a quest for him for quite some time to hit that mark in, I believe, the state of Maine. I believe he's managed to get his 200-pound patch for New Hampshire, but it's been a quest of his for a long time to do that in Maine. So really excited to share that story with you. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get cracking and get Neil on the line. All right, we are live, and today John and I are joined here on episode number 44 with Neil Pendleton. Neil is coming to us from the New England area. Funny story is that Neil and I actually connected very early on when I had initially started the podcast. I was talking about some public land that I was hunting in Ohio. It just so happened that he and I were hunting in close proximity to one another in the Buckeye State. And he was fearful that I might let the cat out of the bag of some of the good hunting that we were having out there. But I did try to keep a tight lip on it, and hopefully he had some good hunts out there this year, and I'm sure we'll dive into that. But Neil, how you doing, brother? Thanks for coming on.
I'm doing great. So thanks for having me, Clint.
Yeah, you bet, man. I know, we're catching up just a little bit here before we started recording, and there's, an interesting perspective of, I think the deer hunters in the New England areas. I'll just kind of classify the region because I know you hunt a couple different states up in that area. I know when we talk about big deer in most other areas, especially when you got in the Midwest, they're talking about inches and stuff like that. And I know you shot out a Facebook post here a couple weeks ago that caught my eye where you're talking about your big buck patch or your 200-pound patch, and we'll get into that. But that's really what we're going to kind of talk about today, folks, is, a little bit of I guess not a geography lesson, but kind of talking about how, the differences in terms of hunting, depending on where, geographically where you're located and where you're hunting. There's, obviously different terrain, there's different, land features that you're going to focus on and stuff like that. But also there's also, a cultural difference that people kind of view hunting, and deer differently in those areas, mature deer versus not mature deer, and what those things all kind of equate to. And we'll dive into that into more detail, man. But before we do that, bro, why don't you give us a background, a little bit of information about Neil Pendleton? What's his story? How'd you start hunting? Where do you live specifically? What do you do for a living?
All right, yeah. Well, I started, starting with the hunting piece. That's what I love talking about. I got into hunting at age 11 with my father. He introduced me to it. I hunted with my dad and my grandfather growing up in coastal Maine. I grew up in Belfast, Maine, so I hunted just inland of that area. So I primarily started rifle hunting for the month of November. That's when we hunt. So I was doing a lot of that, and then from there, I kind of moved, through college, started hunting in New Hampshire, because that's where I went to college. So I've done, a lot of different, whether it's rifle hunting, archery hunting, getting into muzzle loading hunting. So that's pretty much, how I grew up and getting into it through my father.
Nice. And then, did you make the switch? Because I know of course you bow hunt. When did you make that I don't want to say transition, but when did that kind of become something that became important to you?
So that was in 2010. I got into archery. So right now I'm currently 34. So this is my 24th season that I've been hunting. Mm-hmm. So then in 2010, living in New Hampshire, there was a lot longer season. So that's pretty much what drew me into the archery piece. It was just, the fact that you get an extra month and a half, so almost 2 months long, to be able to be out there in the timber going after the deer. Yeah,
no, I hear that, man. And I'll also say, for me, it's as sad as it might sound, it's like the older I get, man, it's like I really like those nice, those warmer hunts than the bitter cold hunts. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not gonna turn in my man card necessarily, but trying to get it done in October sometimes, as much as I love hunting late season is one of my favorite times to hunt, just because the woods kind of clear out. I call it like the fair weather hunters are kind of gone at that point to a degree, and so you get a lot of land that you typically wouldn't get to yourself. You do that time of year, I find, which I like if you can stand the cold. But my feet, for whatever reason, I can't find anything that'll keep my feet warm. So I definitely like those archery days, early archery days for sure, for the comfort. But hey, I know you mentioned New Hampshire, right? So I'm guessing, not to get sidetracked here, but you're a New England Patriots fan?
I am, yes, and of course, as I think I know what you're alluding to. We have the game coming up this Sunday. Patriots Steelers.
That's right, man. We might have to put a little off off the record wager on this one after the call's over. I'm not sure how I feel about it. We don't have a great record against Tom Brady, so I might just be handing over some winnings to you if we do make a bet. Just be
especially something
candy
to play for after the Pats had a tough game. Last night they ended up losing, so they got really something to play for. They got to beat the Steelers this weekend and try to clinch up home field.
Yeah, I know. I was like, man, I just don't send a ticked off Tom Brady to Pittsburgh, please. But I was the biggest Patriots fan last night because I was really hoping the Dolphins would lose that game because I didn't want an angry Tom Brady. But it looks like that's not gonna be in my favor. But back to hunting.
Well,
anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how was your 2017 season, man? I know you. Just via social media and some chatting back and forth that we've done, I know you had kind of it was a tough season overall. So just give me a sense of how your season went and what was the most challenging parts of it so far.
Yeah, so for me, 2017, it's definitely been a slower season than what I'm typically used to. Just didn't see as many deer. I thought going into it, I had a couple of target bucks that I was after, and I ended up prior to the season, getting the trail camera photos, was seeing a lot of movement, a lot of daylight movement too, of especially my main target. And so he was pretty killable the first month of the season. I just with that chess game, wasn't in the right spot at the right time. And a couple of times I had the right plan, looked at the trail camera pictures and looked back and said, okay, why is he moving at this time in this direction, and found a pattern with one particular spot where there was a west wind, and the next west wind in the forecast, planned on sitting there and second guessed myself and actually changed my plan. So it was that whole just wrong spot, wrong time. Seeing less deer. I made a trip down to Ohio to hunt some public ground down there. Just with the weather and the rut hadn't really kicked off. Didn't see much deer down there. So it's one of those that really had to be persistent this season, and I've kind of always believed that persistence will pay off in the end. You put your time in and just stay diligent, that eventually you'll have that opportunity. And luckily, after starting to get a little discouraged, my trip up to Maine is what really I think changed everything. Going back to the home state.
Right. So it's interesting, man. You're getting on some deer there during the season. You're looking for your target deer, wrong place, wrong time. I can totally, sympathize with you there, and I think John can too, just as far as like the chess match goes, and always kind of feeling like you're a step behind. But I'm curious, are you using trail camera data from this year, or do you do anything with trail camera data from a historical perspective? Do you look at patterns year over year and then try to use this year's data, like what you would call, I guess, MRI, most recent intelligence, or whatever, to kind of make your final kill stand or whatever at that moment, or are you relying really solely on this year's information?
A lot of it is probably from previous seasons, looking back and seeing what the annual patterns have been. From listening to a lot of podcasts, which I think are amazing resources. You get to learn and hear from experiences of other hunters, and a lot of times, especially these mature bucks, they do the same thing year after year. It may not be the exact date, the exact time, but they're pretty close. Whether it's a food source, whether it's when does go into heat, really moving through certain areas at similar times. And for me, really having experience starting in 2011 to 2015, it spanned over 5 seasons with a buck that I hunted then. He taught me a lot, and I really learned so much from him. That's what I've found, is that we start looking at past seasons trail camera data. You can start putting those pieces of the puzzle together to say, okay, this deer is moving through that area at this time because of these reasons, and you start to really figure it out. And then, of course, even with the most information and the most hopeful plan, it doesn't always work out. But at least you can start to target and kind of pinpoint from looking at that trail camera data, and whether it's weather, using other, like I use like weather underground, so you can even look back at historical weather and wind patterns and really try to correlate and find some of those patterns.
Right. Yeah, I know for me that was one of the big game changers, I think, is just starting to put more of the historical pieces together, and starting to figure out what a deer is doing year over year. And it was, the light bulb went off. I remember the first time I kind of started understanding that, or someone had told that to me, or wherever I picked it up from, and I started going back through and looking at old trail camera data and stuff like that at a particular buck, and was like, man, don't you know? I was like, that guy shows up to that scrape every year within this 3-day window. You know what I mean? It was like, it was clockwork. Which is nice if you can kind of get those same kind of scenarios, as you'd mentioned. A lot of it kind of, you got to get the weather to line up, and all those kind of factors as well. But at least you have a what I'll call a play sheet to kind of start from. At least you're not starting from ground zero. So let me ask, man. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and really having those starting points, are huge. I mean, I think it gives you, that confidence. You're going in, with that plan. You can try to say, hey, it's like, this is the time I want to hunt it. Because a lot of times there's no point to hunt certain stands. That's one thing I found out. As much as you may, have the thought that, okay, the cold front's coming. It's like all these factors are lining up, but and you look back and see some of the other pieces of the puzzle. There's no point in sitting there. It's probably going to be a waste of my time if he doesn't move through that direction unless it's a specific wind. As much as you want to go and do it, and you have to listen to your gut a lot of times. It's just you're kind of just burning maybe that stand out.
Yeah, that was I think that you hit, something important there is like, as you, at least this is me, I'll speak from personal experiences, like as you kind of mature as a hunter in general. And then, I think more specifically as a bow hunter, you start to understand that hunting smarter is probably in your best interest than hunting harder, if that makes sense. Right? I don't want to say that people don't hunt hard. That's not maybe the right word, but like you were saying, it's like not burning out certain stand locations, knowing that when the right opportunity or when the best opportunity is going to present itself, and making sure you're there at that moment to give yourself a chance. Because I think early on, I think one of the biggest things is like, one of my favorite quotes I think is, your best stand is your next one. And I think it's actually something I picked up from Don Higgins. I read something that he wrote or heard him say it somewhere. And that might even be a Steve Bartilla-ism as well. But it was the notion that, people get hung up on sitting certain sets that they've had success in the past. And they feel like, there's a reason that it was successful once, it should be successful again. And so you kind of hone in on these handful of places where you've had success, where I guess data has proven out where it's, the first time you set a stand is typically your best set in that stand, and so you should always be looking forward to the next stand that you're going to set. And that you should be looking at it with confidence, saying that's going to be my best one, because you're going to it for a reason. You have your 3 reasons, whether the wind's right, you have recent intelligence there, or you had, I'm just giving examples, you had an observation set that you saw a deer walk within distance of that location. You know what I mean? So those would be your 3 reasons why you should be in that stand, and that should give you confidence that that's going to be your best bet. Which is something I've tried to follow through with. It's easier said than done, I think, because there's often you want to fall back to the old faithfuls. But it takes a little bit of diligence and a little bit of persistence to make that happen. But I wanted to ask you, man, are you hunting? I know we were talking offline a little bit. In Ohio, I know you in the past have had some access to some different parcels. But we want to get a sense: are you hunting predominantly public land or private land in these different areas that you're hunting?
So that's where, up here in the Northeast, when I hunt, primarily, I guess the states that I've hunted, Maine is where I grew up, so I've hunted in Maine the most, New Hampshire the second most. I've hunted here for quite a few years in New Hampshire. I've, gone to Ohio for 2 seasons, and I've actually now hunted 1 day in Massachusetts, because the season goes a little bit longer down in Mass. It goes until the 30th this month, so I just recently bought my license there. But as far as the type of land that I hunt, the biggest difference, I think, in the Northeast, which is something that I think is a little different to a lot of people, especially in the area that you're at, is we have what's called like common land use. So unless land is posted, it's open to anyone to use it for, different recreational things. So for hunting purposes, unless you walk into and see posted signs, you can go onto any piece of woods and go ahead and hunt it, which sounds great because you have access to unlimited, amount of land. But it also means if you're trying to target, big mature bucks, that anybody else can also hunt that land as well.
Right.
So your best laid plans can get foiled by someone else who just happens to come, walking through or sees your truck parked there. Right. So that's, even though a lot of it's considered private, it's the same as hunting public in other states. Right.
John, question for you. Just curious about your perspective on this. Like, what do you think as a Iowan, about that type of public land use? I guess it would be similar to almost like BLM land when you go out into like the western states like Montana or whatever. What do you think of that? Mm-hmm. Do you think that's something interesting, good, bad? Like, what's your take on it?
My view on public land, this past year out in Montana, I loved it. Mm-hmm. The public land aspect this year, I really, really wanted to see it, pan out a lot better. And, we used to have a lot of food plots along the public state ground here. And I think there's a lack of funding that has kept them from being able to do the food plots. And in all honesty, the chunk of public timber down here by me is becoming more of a forestry preserve, not a wildlife preserve. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They seem to be focusing on the tree aspect than the habitat.
Right.
I still love public land. There's something to be said about going out there and grinding it out there and getting it done on public. I just wasn't seeing the number of deer out there this year like I have in the past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's pros and cons to it, right? I think it opens up access, which is great, and I don't know, I'm not familiar with the Northeast, Neil, where you live and what access looks like. I know one of the things that's just challenging around where I live in the Philadelphia area, I think it could be interesting and good in this area only because there is limited state land that you can hunt in this area, and it's relatively densely populated. And for me, just where I live particularly, it's a little bit of a drive to any piece of the public land. It's not because it's the only land that's there to hunt. There's plenty of farmland and stuff once you get kind of north of Philadelphia into like the Bucks County kind of area as you're headed toward the Poconos a little bit. I think it would be interesting for something like that in this state, only because you do have a ton of farmland in certain areas and you have a state also with super high deer or hunter density numbers too. Something like, I don't know, it's between 700 and 900,000 hunters on like the first day of deer season. So to give them the opportunity to spread out a little bit might do some good as far as everyone's opportunity to have ample ground to hunt if they so choose. So I think that's kind of an interesting take. I think the other thing it might solve for now, if you arrow a deer or shoot a deer or whatever the case is, do you still have I assume if you have the right to hunt it, you have the right to go across property lines to retrieve anything that you're harvesting as well? Is that true?
Yeah, and that's what actually was funny, too, when I started, hearing about, buddies could go, to the Midwest and go hunting. That was the first time I actually heard that, because when it was new to me that, if you're hunting one property and a deer runs across, onto another property, you have to get permission to go get it. And it's like the first time I heard that, it was like, wait a minute, you have to ask, you can't just go get your deer. And I mean, it makes sense, but that's not something that we have to deal with unless, hits a wall of posted signs. That's really the only time you'd have to worry about it. For us, it's just, you have just free access to, kind of go where you want, and which is something that, especially once you get up into the big woods, where I live in New Hampshire, the southern part of the state. So it is a little more urbanized. So of course you're going to run into, houses and, developments and roads and things like that. But when you get up, in the Maine, more where our cabin is, you can really it's all paper company land, and it's just, vast, there's, logging roads, all over the place, but you don't have to worry about, running into houses or, posted signs. So you kind of get to just really, it's an adventure. You get to explore. That's part of the allure, I think, of going to those big woods is you can just, you don't know what's over the next ridge. You may have never seen these woods before. You don't know what to expect. And as much as you're looking, for, the next big buck, you just get to see things that you've never seen before. And it's kind of like you get that, that boyhood, almost like an adventure where you just, really get to see things and, just take in the sights.
Yeah, I agree with you there, man. That's one of the things that I do enjoy, hunting. I got to do some big woods hunting. Well, this year definitely when I was in Ohio, was all big woods hunting. And you're right. You're always kind of curious. It's good and it's bad for me because I always have the curiosity of what's around the next bend or over the next knoll or whatever. And so I have the hardest time like figuring out where I'm going to set up because I'm like, well, let me just walk over this next ridge. You know what I mean? It's like, and then I get up.
And then when you do set up, you second guess it because you're like, it's like, well, maybe that next ridge or that next tree or, that next little piece, it could be a little better or, that could, be where the deer are traveling. So that is the tough part about having that much access.
It is, but I'd rather have more than less. It's funny you mentioned about, going to retrieve your deer. It's because growing up where I grew up, we always knew all the farmers that were around us. Everyone had land and our families grew up together. And even if we weren't like best of friends or whatever, during hunting season, it's like if you shot a deer and it ran over onto, the college's farm next door or whatever, it's like I just went over and got it. You know what I mean? Like there was no like go talk to them because it's like I would see them at school or I would see them at the grocery store or the church or, we'd have, wrestling practice together or whatever, you know what I mean? So there was no like, maybe it was just a simpler time than all the way around, possibly. Right.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, of course, then you always hear that, the opposite end, somebody who didn't, give someone permission, didn't allow someone to get it. It's just, you can't, you scratch your head on that. It's like, wow, it's like to even think that could happen, for me growing up and never having to worry about that. Because there is, pretty much no boundaries. It's just, just a completely different way of thinking.
Yeah. And I just don't understand what the reason would be to not allow someone to go, pick up go gather up an animal that they've harvested. You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand the thought process of why you would deny someone that. It's not as though you killed it or that it's yours, because honestly, it's not yours. It's owned by the state. It's a state resource. It's not even that you own the wildlife that inhabits your land in general. But anyway, we could go on that rant for forever. But I want to hear a little bit about the areas that you're hunting. I want to talk about the topography, terrain, land features that influence how you hunt the Northeast area. So if you could start, just kind of give us a little bit of. I know you mentioned it's big woods. So just give us kind of like, if you would, just do some theater of the mind here and paint the listeners a picture of where you're hunting typically and what things kind of look like in those areas.
Yeah, so when I go up to the cabin up in Maine, I mean, up there it's all paper company land, and there's actually part of a land trust where there's, I think, 5 million acres, between Maine and New Brunswick as part of the land trust and never be developed. So the paper company, they can come in, they can log it, and it's all forestry. They can put in roads and do all that, but as far as what's there for cabins, that's what's going to be there. There's nothing else that's going to be developed. So that's where you have, unfortunately, I think a lot of, and this I think is another probably new concept. Have you heard of a deer yard before?
I've not heard of a deer. I've heard of deer yarding when they huddle during the
cold. So that's pretty. Yeah, so that's up in a lot of the Northeast states. Historically, because we used to get really severe winters, the deer would do that. They'd go to what we call the yards, and they would yard up. And so a lot of that can be whether it's spruce groves or cedar swamps because they have feed and have cover, so the snow won't get as deep. But a lot of those have been the paper companies have cut those off for the timber and for the wood. Then a lot of other whether it's beech or oak. I mean, a lot of that stuff has also, been cut off. So as far as the terrain, it's always changing. So you could have, select cuts, you could have clear cuts, you could have, new growth, you could have, depending on where it is, up on top of a ridge or near a lake, you could still have a little bit of, older woods. I wouldn't call them mature forest. You have, some bigger trees. You still could have some mixed hardwoods left in there. So, I mean, that's where there's just, really vast open woods. A lot of it's thick, so it's not necessarily, when I say open, like you can't see through it a long ways because you have a lot of undergrowth that's there, which becomes feed for the deer. So that's where in the northern states, a lot of it is, I mean, there's not like a lot of mass crops. It's just, them browsing as they walk around. So you kind of wonder sometimes, especially if it's late in the season, everything's brown and dead looking. It's like, where the deer eating? And they just continually eat all day long and browse.
Right. So do you have some elevation change in that area? Are you working with elevation change, or what's it look like from that perspective?
Yeah, so there is a lot of elevation change. It's more what we call ridges, or probably more like hills. I know when I've driven through, Pennsylvania, of course, you see just hills that go, for miles and miles, these ridges that just are really long. We have more, they don't have like long tops. They just kind of come up to a point and they may go off, for a mile or two, but there's really one kind of defined high point and they'll go off in other areas. It's not like just a big, long running ridge. So there is, a lot of elevation changes. There's, swamps that they're scattered in. Whether it's, more like marsh type swale grass with, river or small ponds in there, or whether it's like cedar swamps. So there's a whole bunch of, different types of terrain and different features that are up there. And a lot of the questions that come up, from people, are you seeing the deer, up high, which means are they up on top of the ridges? Or are they down the lowlands, like down the swamps and held up there? So there's two different, kind of areas where a lot of times, you'll find the deer. And that is one thing up there that, we're talking about, kind of the next stand is the best stand. Well, we're in many ways forced to do that because the deer densities are low and they do move from year to year. So you're pretty much going back to the drawing board. And there is some spots where historically, because of terrain features, that they will, be there year after year. But for the most part, they're moving mostly because of the logging. When they've, harvested a certain area, a few years afterwards, you're getting that new growth, which becomes food. They'll be in those areas. So you're having like those pockets of deer that bounce around. So one year that was really good, and you found a ton of sign. There was a lot of deer that were in there. There may not be a deer for another 2 or 3 miles. So you may have to move over quite a bit, and have the occasional deer that roams through, but they're kind of it's always different from year to year.
Right. That's interesting because that was one thing that I was definitely keying in on when I was in Ohio. That's because it was similar. It was just big. Actually, if you got off the public land off the back side of it, I think it was on the north side of that property, was a paper company that owned a bunch of property. And it was kind of what you're kind of describing, big woods, no agriculture or that was really around. So they were, living off of acorns and browse and stuff like that. It's just interesting how like I hunted it the same but different, right? So if I'm hunting, where I hunted last year in Ohio, or when I'm hunting Pennsylvania, like our family farms and stuff like that, so I don't hunt food sources per se. Like I don't typically often sit on a food source. It's like I'll often sit like in a pinch point headed toward a food source or coming back from a food source to bed, or I'll find like a saddle between two high points that it's kind of like that'll move deer from point A to food source or whatever the case might be. So I was following similar concepts while I was in Ohio, only I was finding saddles that deer were using to run to these fresh clear cuts, and those clear cuts were honestly like the public land food plot. You know what I mean? It was like find what's relatively fresh, or relatively new, and as long as it's not too. I think our criteria was something like within 0 to 3 years is really, I was out with my buddy Chad, and that was kind of his gauge was like anything that was like 0 to 3 years of growth is something worth investigating and hunting. Over 3 years, he really wasn't so interested in it, because at that point you're getting to a point to where the food is now starting to elevate just slightly above deer level. And so that would be somewhere that, unless you really had intel to tell you to be there, you might want to overlook it. So I'm just curious, man, like how in terms of like stand setup in the Northeast versus when you go to Ohio, like how are you determining, are you using the same principle? Well, I'm sure you're using the same principles, but I mean, how are you kind of, I guess, distilling the information and determining where you're going to set a stand up in the Northeast versus how you would take, your approach to set up a stand location in, a Midwestern state like Ohio?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of times that I've been to Ohio, I mean, the stand placement, I don't want to say a lot of it's more obvious, I guess, but you do have obviously a lot higher deer density, so you can see, whether it's trails, especially if you're going, a little bit later in the season, once the leaves have fallen, you can start to see, kind of those beaten runs and trails. And so depending on the part of the state of Maine where you go, a lot of people, if they hunt over, more in the Forks area, over in Jackman, there's bigger woods over there, the deer do seem to follow a lot more runs. But in the area where our camp is more over in the kind of downeastern, part of the state, you're getting the central, more the eastern part of the Maine. They don't really seem to, stick to like specific trails. They just seem to they'll come through that general area, but it could be a couple hundred yards off one way or the other. And so being primarily a stand hunter, and that's something that I've always, grown up hunting from a stand. I do love to do some tracking in snow and hop on a track and, catch up to, a nice buck once you've cut that good track. I've, done some still hunting, but I really have never, kind of had the patience for, walking and stopping and just waiting. So I've primarily stand hunted. So when looking at stand locations, a lot of it is, looking for, the signs. So whether you're looking, for deer droppings, whether you're looking for rubs or scrapes, or whether you're looking for a lot of times tracks and getting back, to, I think, how we used to do it before trail cameras, is looking for a lot of that sign. And once you found, big tracks, that buck in that area, and you see, what looks like to be, a 200 plus pound track, or if you see multiple, in that area, that's a spot you then need to kind of start to look at, and really say, okay, where do I think is the best odds, and really weigh out the percentages. If I'm going to put in my time and hunt a spot, that eventually there's going to be that opportunity that a big buck's going to come through here. And that's something that I think for us just recently we've kind of more gravitated towards, with my father and I, doing that, where it's like you want to find a spot where you're going to say, okay, that if I sit here long enough, there's a good odds that something is going to come through, versus, trying to find a spot where it looks like there's all kinds of activity and seeing a sign or getting a picture and then, setting up there because of that. So it's really, whether it's pinch points between a terrain feature, in a swamp, whether it's, looking at, benches and saddles, using lakes to almost make, like a pinch point, in between lakes. There's a lot of features that go into trying to find stand placement, and then you have to go and look at it and actually see, okay, am I seeing sign coming through here? And up in those areas, snow always helps, but unfortunately we don't seem to really get any snow anymore, which for me, I usually try to plan my hunt to Maine. Living down in New Hampshire, it's a 6-hour drive up to our cabin. and in Maine you can't hunt Sundays. So to go up for a weekend, it's really just it's not worth the drive. Getting out of work on Friday, 6 hours up, hunt one day, and turn around and come 6 hours back. So I usually plan for me to go up in the late season, which the way the seasons run in Maine is there's a rifle season, that's the month of November, and it always ends the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and then there's a week of muzzleloader. So for me, knowing that usually with work, most places close on Thanksgiving, I usually try to start my vacation to save a couple of days right around the time of Thanksgiving, so it falls on Thursday, take off, hunt the last couple of days of rifle, and be up there for the muzzleloader season, because that's when the bucks, the primary rut's over, so their does in their area have all been bred. So now they're just seeking out and they're just roaming, it could be 10, 15, 20-mile ranges where they're trying to look for another doe. So when that starts to happen, you're now seeing a lot more buck movements. They're not held up in a smaller area. So that's when you get better odds looking at those terrain features and just really trying to put your time in a spot and almost wait them out.
Right. Yeah, I definitely kind of ran into that this year in the big woods. What you were talking about with the distance of movement, just in general, it's one thing I think whenever you're hunting, like the farm that we have back home or whatever, where it's like if I see a buck on a pattern, it's like I can pretty much guess that he's probably going to come and hit that same pattern every handful of days, every 2 or 3 days. He's going to come back to that same spot if I have the right intel, right? To pattern one in the big woods is tough, man, because like you don't know how far they're traveling. You know what I mean? Like he might. I had one on camera that was a really beautiful 10-point, and I was Jones to like the nth degree that he was on camera and he was in this pinch point, and I was like, man, that's it. I'm gonna sit there the first 3 days, and like that deer. I went back and checked the camera again after, like I guess it was near the last day that we were there, and he never ever made his way back to that same spot. He's like, where did he go? It's like he obviously was running that. We had him, I believe, on camera on the ridge behind us too. So it's like he was in that area. It's just he never came by that spot again. And just so the distance that they have to travel, trying to pattern a deer like you would hunting ag land. It's just a different animal. And that was like, I think we talked about this on one podcast. That was like probably one of my biggest learning opportunities this year where I was hunting, was just in that scenario, I needed to be more aggressive and be more willing to move more often. Only because I wasn't getting good deer activity. It sounds like you're kind of setting up and doing the opposite of that, which is that if you see what you need to see, you're going to put your time in. Is that what I'm hearing? Before we continue our conversation, let's talk about Wicked Tree Gear saws. If you're tired of cheap-ass flimsy handsaws, or better yet, a pole saw that doesn't work for a damn, try Wicked Tree Gear, the toughest saws on earth. Order now by visiting wickedtreegear.com and use the promo code TRUTH to save 20% on your purchase and also receive free ground shipping. And now back to the show.
Yeah, it sometimes becomes a waiting game where, a lot of times, I'd sit mornings and evenings. You try to wait for, the activity that's happening in the morning and happening, before dark in the evening. But what I found is that a lot of that movement, they just don't stop. It's like there is no real, even when we've gotten snow and you hop on a track, they will walk all day long, not lay down, not, sidestep and feed. It's just straight line and just going. So when they're covering that much ground and they're just walking all day long, you're pretty much, your best odds are to just pick one spot and just wait it out and have an area where it's like the deer are gonna have to eventually come through there because of terrain features. One example of one spot, is whether it's between a couple of lakes that has a little pinch point of like a thoroughfare, that narrows out where it may be 100 yards between. Well, as opposed to going a couple of miles out around the lakes, they're probably gonna have to come through that area. But then, of course, you start looking at, the cuts. It's like, well, is that one 7 or 8 years old on one side? The other one's now 4 or 5. Well, yeah, there's not as many deer in those areas. So are you going to put in your time there? Or are you going to go sit somewhere over like a big swale swamp where you have maybe, like a couple of mile, stretch in one direction, another mile stretch in another direction, and you have that narrowest point in the middle where maybe the beavers had dammed up the brook coming through, so the water flowing out on the opposite side of the beaver dam, it's a lot shallower, so the deer naturally are going to cross at that narrowest point where there's also too shallower water. But you may sit there, for 3-4 days or even a week, and there may not be any deer that comes through during daylight, and all of a sudden it's that giant buck, which is why you go up to the northeast, to hunt.
Right. Nice. Yeah, I don't know. I totally hear. I understand what you're saying, and it's like it makes sense. I personally would just have a hard time. I would have a hard time doing it, I think. You know what I mean?
So that's why I started laughing. So you can just tell it just by your expression. It's completely different. You go from seeing a lot of deer and being entertained and waiting, for a good one, to you're just waiting to see a deer. It's like just to have a sign of life. It's like see a squirrel, see a bird sometimes.
Right.
And but then it's like you could have the biggest deer you've ever dreamed of step around the corner, and that's not just rack size, but the bigger bodies that you get up there.
Right.
Because when you start looking at, I think the different subspecies of types of deer, the line comes across Canada and kind of goes through Maine. So we start getting to that central, that upper portion of Maine. You're getting some huge body deer where getting deer over 200 pounds. I don't want to say it is is the norm, but it is a lot more common. It's a real possibility. And then of course you start getting up pushing 300 pounds, dressed. Not even talking live weight.
Right.
Happens usually in the upper 200 pound classes, which it's a whole different breed of animal. I mean, to see a deer that big, it's a sight to behold.
Right. Yeah. That was definitely the thing in Ohio. That was the toughest part, because we were there 8 days, I guess, that we hunted ish, and I saw what was it, 3 deer in 8 days. That was tough. But I mean, you're 100% right. It's like I was doing it, holding out for hope that I was going to see the right one, because the age structure on that piece of property, just what we had on trail camera, told us that now we're talking inches here versus the body size that you're talking about, but just a big mature deer. Just in general, like that was a real possibility because the age structure was really good. So that's kind of what kept you going. But you're right. It's like I would see, birds and be like, man, that's probably all I'm going to see today is birds. But
and sometimes too, it's like when we get back to camp and it's like, all right, it's like I didn't even see a squirrel today. It's like it's like wow, it's like it's just you're just waiting for a sign of life to walk by, and you sit from sun up to sundown. It's like, or even just putting a bunch of hours in and then walk around. It's tough. It becomes mentally taxing,
right?
Especially sitting out in the freezing cold.
Yeah, and then you get to the point where you start to get a little meta, where you're like, am I actually alive, or is this all just a figment of some weird energy of the universe that you know what I mean? Where it's like, if nobody knows that I'm here and there's nothing else that's alive around me, am I actually here? You know what I mean? It's like, maybe I'm the only one that has those deep thoughts, and I should keep them to myself, possibly.
Well, when you sit out in the woods long enough, Clint, I'm sure we've all had some weird thoughts when we're sitting out there long enough.
Yeah, exactly. Moving on to more real world things here. I want to get into you mentioned earlier cutting a track of a big deer. Then you referenced a couple of times the 200 pound mark, or just like a big mature deer when you get up into those that area of the country. So I want to kind of dive into that, because I know that what kind of I mentioned at the beginning, and the social media post that you made was about the 200 pound deer, and you were talking about getting your big buck patch. So I've personally never heard of this. This was the first time I've heard of it, and it was kind of funny because when you sent that post out and I saw it, it was interesting because a buddy of mine and I were just talking about a deer that we had on camera, actually at my dad's place. And we were just kind of commenting on the fact that, he might be a rare 200 plus pound Pennsylvania buck, because that's for PA, that's a huge deer if he's 200 or bigger, and he looks like he has a real possibility of it. And then I saw your post and just thought, like, man, I got to learn more about this. So I'm just curious, what is the 200 pound patch distinction, and where does that come from?
So, growing up in Maine, obviously the question in any type of hunting community is, you get your deer yet, right?
Right.
I'm sure that's the same in Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
So, you get your deer yet? And of course, it's like, yeah, I got my deer, and everyone wants to know, is it a good one? How many points? Stuff like that. But then of course, it's, hey, well, if it was a good one, well, was it over 200 pounds? And that was a goal, that I've always, been growing up with, because that's when you get, you get an entry in the biggest buck clubs of Maine, which it has to be, over 200 pounds, dressed. So, obviously you've had to gut it out the deer. You have to remove the heart, lungs, and liver, for it to go and qualify for that. And, has to be weighed on certified scales. And so that, because I think maybe historically, like the racks, growing up in Maine, from hearing like my grandfather talk, a lot of it was that, it was for meat. That's how you fed your families a lot of times was going hunting. And so then it started to get into bigger deer. And so racks really weren't something that was, I guess, a goal really of many hunters. So it was looking, for the biggest deer possible. And, it's, obviously a sign of, the mature deer. And so that 200-pound mark, I don't know exactly, where it stemmed from, but in a lot of the Northeast states, in Maine, you get that big buck club. And, even when I posted that post on Facebook, because that's something that for 24 seasons, had eluded me in Maine, and that, meant a lot to me, that I wanted to get one over, 200 pounds. And so when I finally accomplished it, you have other people who have gotten entries, and they're like, welcome to the club. It's, that accomplishment, and that, that kind of almost badge of honor that you've done it. And for me, in New Hampshire, it's also a club they call it, the Trophy Buck Club of New Hampshire. I've done it 4 times in New Hampshire. So I actually did it my first morning ever hunting in New Hampshire within probably, I think it was within about the first hour. And that one meant a lot to me because my grandfather, growing up, he'd always said, hey, for us Pendleton hunters, I think you're going to grow up to be, the best hunter, out of all of us. And, you're shooting, some big bucks, you start showing a lot of potential. And so before he passed away, because health was starting to diminish, that was like every step I took in the woods was, what, I want to get one over 200 pounds. I want to get one over 200 pounds. I want to prove it to him, before he passes. And so I was fortunate that season back in like either 2005 or 2006. That was with a firearm. I did it with a rifle, and then I'd gotten 3 others through archery with a bow that were over 200 pounds dressed. But I could never do it in Maine. I would come close, 198 pounds, 196, a bunch in the 180s. But so finally, this season is when I was able to finally, complete, I guess, my mission and kind of, get in the club.
Nice, man. That's awesome. That's cool that you were able to have that, make that happen, while your grandfather was still around. That's a cool story, man. It's interesting that that's actually like a thing, because like I didn't realize that it was actual like a legit like record book like thing that was like captured and recorded. Like that's kind of cool, man. Like I didn't realize that was, when I first read your post and was, thinking about it, I was like, oh, this must be like a group of buddies or like a larger, hunting group that you are affiliated with. You know what I mean? That like they talk about this, and this is something that they discuss and they try to achieve or whatever. But like the way you're describing it, it's like almost, I don't want to say like a Pope and Young club, because I know that they do a lot more than just record deer and elk and rams or whatever.
It's the same type thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But man, that's cool. I'm curious, man. Like, so like I had an interest in it as soon as I had seen the story, just from like you wrote an incredible story, how it all kind of unfolded. But I'm just curious, when we first started talking about it, I think it was via Facebook, you mentioned, when you talk to other hunters about it, and I'm curious what other hunters aside from myself, like what their reaction has been when you talk about the 200-pound distinction, whenever you're talking about, hunters from Ohio or Illinois or whatever, like what's their take on it?
Yeah. I mean, probably the conversation that stands out the most to me was this season I'm down in Ohio, and I was running, a little kind of loft, apartment, from a guy down there, that I happened to, just kind of meet, through, calling before I went down, the season before. And so we're standing in the garage. It's him and his brother, a couple of buddies, are hanging out, and we're all down there. And, when I start talking about, this, obviously you're trading deer stories and accomplishments. I'm starting to talk about weights, and you're seeing some of those, kind of funny looks. And I talk about, the 200, pound mark, and, how, in New Hampshire, it's like I've gotten 4 over 200 pounds. And like, well, hold on, wait a minute. Like when I was saying 200, they're like inches, right? And I'm like, no, like weight, because for us, growing up, in Maine and everyone in New Hampshire, that I'm friends with, it's usually, that's how big was it? How much did it weigh? I mean, obviously people want to know how many points, but inches really until probably the last 5 years, I'd say, because of, social media and TV. Right. I don't even think people really knew about inches or even scoring racks, to be honest. It was always, the records have always been for weight. I mean, you hear about, these certain bucks. I mean, even the bucks who have the record racks in some of these states, it was always about, well, then how much did it weigh? So that's always the question. That's what more people want to know. So to see the reactions, and they're like, wow, that's pretty cool. I've never really thought of weighing my deer, after I go and shoot it. And, for us growing up, we always heard, the stereotype was, out west in the western states or Midwest is that, they do live weights. They weigh them, with everything still inside. They don't gut out the deer. Because we're still caught up on that weight thing. It still wasn't even really a topic of measuring racks or inches.
Right. So I want to make sure I'm like clear on what the weight means. So like it's gutted, right? Is the hide on? Like,
Yep.
are you taking any of are you taking it off at like the first knuckle or the knees for the hinds and the fronts, or like what goes on the scale? I guess is what I'm asking.
So pretty much, I mean, you've gone obviously, taking out, the stomach, taking out the intestines, entrails, gone through that. Then from there, you're going in the inner sanctum and removing, the heart, lungs, and liver. And so then from there, yeah, you're going to the tagging station. You bring it because actually we have in most of the states still up here. I mean, especially Maine and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, you can phone them in. But in those states, you have to bring them someplace to have them checked in. So once you go and have taken the deer, you put your transportation tag on it, you bring it to a tagging station, and then every tagging station asks you, do you want to weigh it? And most everyone who's gotten especially a good buck, they want to weigh it. It's bragging rights time. Just hoist it up on the scale, so you stand there and you get to watch whether it's a digital scale, or it's the old style scale where you're watching the needle turn around, and you get to see what that weight is, and then it's recorded. And a lot of times in tagging stations, they have the board where they write down the name of the hunter, how many points that they got, and then the weight beside it. So what goes on the scale is the whole entire deer, just with the guts and heart, lungs, and liver removed.
Yeah, man, that's got to be a tough hunt too, man. Because I mean, you're talking about big woods, and I'm assuming that big of a deer has to be a pretty mature animal, right? And so the conditions in the big woods are tough enough as it is, and then tag on the fact that that's got to be a mature animal to hit that weight. Like that's a tough hunt, right?
Oh yeah, I mean it's real
24
tough.
24 years worth of tough.
Well, I think growing up, I had heard that for most hunters, like I can't remember if it was like one lifetime or two lifetimes of 70 years of hunting and stuff like that is what it would take to kind of get that 200-pound mark. There was a lot of different numbers that were thrown out there, but it was one of those things that it takes a long time. It's tough hunting, and some fantastic hunters who are really know what they're doing never have been able to get over that mark. And obviously other guys who are really accomplished can do it year after year or every other year. It's like I know when we start talking about weights, I mean, for us, I think, I mean, there's big names obviously in the hunting industry now, but growing up in this area, I mean, the Benoit family was probably the biggest name. They're big trackers, and you hear things like their lifetime, one of them lifetime average is over 200 pounds. You hear things like that, where it's just like, wow, it's like that's what really gets your blood boiling. Growing up and hearing those stories where you just really didn't hear about racks or inches or points. It was just the weight of the deer and the body size, which is also means mature, old buck.
Right. So John, man, what do you think? Maybe a trip to Maine in our future for a 200-pound patch. Try our hand in the big woods.
Yeah, if we can't get it done, we can always go get lobster or something. I mean. There's good food there, no matter what, whether it's venison or lobster, crab, something. And it's funny. It's funny, talking about how people will reference certain deer and they're, whether they're talking about the live weight or field dressed weight. Where I come from initially in Kentucky, inches and weight is nothing. It is the number of points of the deer. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could have a 2-year-old that's a 16-pointer, and that will trump a 7-year-old 180-inch buck that's 10 points any day of the week. Yeah. So it was always kind of comical to me. And when I first started hunting, I didn't know any better. I just thought, well, a 13-pointer is better than an 8-pointer. Mm-hmm. I mean, sure, one was bigger than the other, but then it was over time. Then you start thinking about how old is the deer and how many inches is the deer and stuff like that. But it always fascinates me to hear and talk to guys from different areas, and that makes it so much cooler because there's always something. There's always an old tradition in a certain area that everybody grew up with differently than somebody else.
Yeah, the 200-inch patch club, man, that would be a cool short film.
Well, and getting back to the patch too, and so sorry to cut you off on the film point. I don't know if you want to mention that a little more, because I was going to mention something about the patch itself.
No, yeah. I want to hear about the patch.
Yeah, so with the patch, I mean, because I guess to really specify what the patch is and what, it was historically used for. I know some guys that, they fill out, at the tag station, the big buck card, that you get to send in, and then they send you back the patch. For some people, like my dad, he's gotten 7 over 200 pounds. He just keeps the cards. He's never actually sent them in. That's for him good enough. He knows that he made it. He's accomplished it. Where a lot of other guys, they send in the cards and they get a patch back that is meant to put on your hunting jacket. Because, it's not like, nowadays we have, different camo schemes and different outfits, whether it's raining, early season, late season, you had your hunting jacket, it was November, it was cold. You put on that jacket, and even in certain states up here, Maine was traditionally more your black and red checkered. That's what, it's what you wore as a Maine hunter. Some of the other states, like especially Vermont, it was more, green and black. Yeah, those checkered. And so you would put that patch and wear it with pride on your jacket. So when you saw another hunter in the woods, you were like, damn, this guy, he's a good hunter. He has that, that patch, on his arm. I haven't gone and done that. I just, kind of keep them, in the envelope, that they get mailed to me. And a lot of times, I haven't gotten my Maine one yet, but I know the guy, he's the president of the trophy, Antler and Skull Association in New Hampshire, Roscoe. He's a great guy, does a lot for hunting in our state. He's the one who, is kind of the record keeper. So whether it's, he scores the racks, he, measures he records all the weights, and he'll send you, your patch, a little letter congratulating you with a little note. And then at the end of the year, when we actually have our what's called Hunting Digest in New Hampshire that's printed out, they have the top 10 deer every year for archery, muzzleloader, and firearms, and it's not rack scores. It is weight. That's what's listed in the Hunting Digest that tells all your laws and regulations. And so they have the top 10 list. So then with that, to make the top 10, which in 2015 I had the biggest archery buck. In 2012 it was the 10th, and then 2011 it was the 5th biggest in New Hampshire. But so you actually get that acknowledgement. It's not just that, hey, you made the club, it's you actually get a ranking of where you were in the state. And they have in the harvest survey at the end of the year, they'll have all the 200 plus pound deer and where it ranked and how many were harvested.
That's awesome, man. I like the fact that you actually get a patch, because it makes me think of a biker gang. Like it's almost like it's like a deer gang. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. I'm getting this mental picture of like a leather vest with all my patches on it. Like I kind of want a patch now. I totally want to do this. Now, I also find it interesting that the different states have different color plaid that they're wearing hunting. I never recognized that before. Is that that's a real thing? Like the one state wears red, the other state wears predominantly green. Is that true?
I mean, it's a little bit. I mean, it just kind of happened that more, through Maine, I think was more the red and black, and some of the other states were green and black. I mean, I can't say it's necessarily state specific, because I know a lot of guys in Maine have also worn the green and black, and I'm sure a lot of other guys have worn the red and black from different states. Right. But yeah, it was just kind of one of those. But that's what you saw geographically. Looking back, that was kind of just more of a tradition, and I don't know where necessarily all that started from, but I know growing up, the jacket that was given to me, the hunting jacket, it was red and black. My dad's was red and black, and then when I see hunters from other states that have the green and black, just wasn't something that was common in Maine that I saw. Really, it's known to Vermont, I think, but also in New Hampshire, because Vermont has a real strong hunting heritage, in their state.
Right. Yeah, man, it's just interesting, like the cultural differences, in the heritage differences from state to state, and what different places latch on to as important to them and stuff like that. I mean, I always just find it interesting how everyone has their own little nuances, how things are done differently, and what's important to them. But I know that you mentioned Maine, right? Was where you got this most recent 200-pound patch, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I want to kind of want to walk through this and have you kind of walk us through the story of the hunt here. So if you wouldn't mind, set the stage for us for this hunt. I know it was a long time in the making for this particular area. So if you wouldn't mind, let us know what season it is and just kind of walk us through, the hunt for this last 200 patch, or this your first Maine 200-pound patch.
Yeah. So I guess the really kind of set story is that, as I said, growing up, I hunted coastal Maine, so it was, smaller woods. So my father, basically he told me this a few years ago. He had, a few goals in life. He wanted to own a Harley Davidson. He wanted to own a piece of land, have it bought and paid for, all these things, and also have a camp on a lake. Well, he had gotten a camp, I think it was about 13 years ago when we were talking earlier today, and he had, the first camp up in the big woods, and it was up on top of a hill that had beautiful views, looking across the lakes. And so that's what was deer camp for the last, 10, 11 seasons. Mm-hmm. So we'd go up there, we'd hunt from that camp, and so every year you get further and further away. And so we started to venture off to where I hunted this last season, this season actually. So where I hunted this season, this was the furthest end of the range. Well, since he always aspired to have one on a lake, he had then, looked at different property. He'd found one that was becoming available on like the bigger lake in the area, which is great for fishing. And so he took that opportunity. He sold the old camp to one of my buddies. He ended up buying that. And then, so we started, it was last season was our first season at the new cabin. So it's, back to the drawing board. Even though we had hunted in this area, we weren't really as familiar with it. So it's trying to figure out, where are the deer, looking at terrain features and finding, good new spots, whether it's looking at the ridges or looking down at swamps. So last year, we had, a successful year. It was, first year at the new camp. I'm assuming do you guys have game poles or like, the tree or something you hang your deer from when you get them? Yeah, buck pole. So we had the buck pole at camp. Last year we had, two nice bucks that we hung on it. And so for this year, coming into the season, I said, okay, well, I know where we had success last year, but I got to try to find some new spots as well. So I made a few trips up there this summer, and when I'm out fishing, trolling around for salmon, out in the lakes, I'm always scouting, right? Whether it's in a boat, whether it's, riding on a four-wheeler in my truck, I'm always, looking around, for deer and for sign and the next best spot. So this summer, when I was, out in the boat trolling, there happened to actually be a ridge a couple of miles down from where our camp was. And I saw this, this ridge. It was beautiful terrain that sloped right down to the lake, and where then the shore took a bend and it went out. Wasn't really a cove, but it made a 90-degree turn and came out to a point. And I saw that, and the ridge stops right there where it comes down to the lake, and it goes away from the lake right there. So it becomes a spot where deer bending around the lake and coming on and off the ridge. There's a point there. And so I said, this just looks like a good spot. So I was up there fishing with my girlfriend, had the dog with me, and I happened to get out and go for a walk one day just to stretch the legs. And my girlfriend said she was going to stay in the boat, and the dog, was going to stay there and relax for a little bit. And so I take off, start walking around, and I start seeing some good buck sign. I'm seeing, some scrapes left over from last year's season. I see some rubs on some trees, and I said, okay, this looks like, a good area. And I hear my girlfriend start calling for the dog. And his name's Henry. So, of course, Henry was taken off from the boat. So I know he's trying to find me. And so he's following my scent trail up, and I see him, and he starts wandering off down kind of off the ridge. And I venture over into that area where he was, and it's a little more open, and I start seeing what looks like a dried up brook and a little run that goes across it. So I decided to go and put a camera over there when I came back over Labor Day weekend. I put a camera out, and so this was beginning of September. So I put out a bunch of different cameras in different areas and had hopes this would be a good spot. And I figured on that run I may get some pictures of a decent buck. So I ended up not getting back up there until I hunted right before Thanksgiving. But my father, he had come down to hunt with me in New Hampshire. So I told him about where this camera was, and said, hey, Dad, I got some different cameras in different spots. You should go ahead and check them out. So he checked that particular camera. He takes the whole month of November off and just goes up to the cabin, no electricity, no running water, just deer camp. So he spends the whole month up there. He checks that camera a couple weeks into it, and sure enough, he had a picture of a nice 10-pointer. It looked like it was about 200 pounds. It had come through by that camera 3 times in October. Then he had gone and put out a couple other cameras in that area. So a couple days go by. He came back to go and check my camera. He checks that one and sees that same buck he had gotten pictures of previously had come by 3 days in a row now. It had come by on a Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, and Thursday morning between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning. So during daylight hours. So, of course, at that point in time, he says, okay, hey, this is a spot to go and set up. Like, I'm going to, put out a stand here. And I kind of, told him, I said, back where the cuts come off down off the side ridge where it makes the bend around, that's where I'd seen, some big buck shit, this summer. I'd seen that over there. Mm-hmm. And I said, that looks like a good spot to probably, maybe fix. You can look back down towards the lake in this area. So he sat there, that Friday morning, and it ended up, snowing, rain mix. It might as well have been rain, he said. And then he gets down and checks the camera, over at the other spot at the bottom of this plateau where the little cut came to an end, and he happened to check it, and the buck that I ended up shooting was on that camera. So of course he sees this buck, beautiful rack on it, tall tine. It was a little blurry in the picture. You can see it had some type of kicker or maybe multiple kickers coming off some of the tines, but it looked like that one was definitely over 200 pounds. So at that point, my dad, he started, hunting in that area a little bit more because he was seeing activity, and there happens to be a few oaks and some beech along that side ridge, or the side ridge there in that area. So I had gone knowing he was hunting there, didn't want to step on his toes and get too closely. So when I arrived up at camp, I scouted some different areas where I hunted last year. Saw some deer over in those spots, but it seemed like a lot of the sign was over where he was hunting. So I started hunting that same ridge up on top and further down and put out some cameras, but all the activity seemed to be kind of centralized around that food source, that late season, traveling through, right. Whether it's does or buck setting. He had jumped a couple of deer over in that area. So that's where, I arrived up at camp, Wednesday night, checked some cameras. So I hunted now the last 3 days of rifle. I hunted Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. On Sunday, we kind of put our game plan together. He was going to keep hunting down that side. I was going to go and hunt up on top of the ridge, only probably about 0.3 of a mile away from where he was. Mm-hmm. So at that point in time, now it's Monday morning, so we've got our plans. We're all excited. We go in. We both had climbing tree stands. So we take, our climbing stands in. Normally when I'm archery hunting, I'll hunt like out of, a lot of lone wolf stuff. But when it comes to gun hunting, you have that comfort a lot of times of the summit stand. It's almost sitting a lazy boy up in a tree.
Right.
Plus you have that bar to be able to shoot off. And so now on Monday morning, it's muzzleloader season. So I'm sitting up on top, and I'm up on the ridge, waiting for something to come through, and the wind's starting to pick up. And I've been sitting for a couple of hours now, and okay, I haven't seen anything yet. And all of a sudden, I get that jump in my seat, boom! I hear a shot go off. Well, my father just touched one off. So of course we don't have a lot of service up there. So I send out a text, and I'm like, all right, I know it's him. It's close. I'm wondering, what it is. Did he get the big one? So I, going, waiting for the text back, and 15, 20 minutes goes by, and he says, yep, I got one. Is it down? He said, yep, it's down. So I'm all excited. My dad got one, but I still don't, know what it is. And he's like, oh, I think it's, an 8-pointer or a 7-pointer, somewhere around in there. And so I said, well, should I come down and look? He's like, no, it's not a huge one. And he had said the day before there was stuff that he wanted to get done around the camp. So you can tell last week of the season, he wanted to do some stuff. He wasn't going to be, too picky that last week. And he normally holds out. So that's where at that time I said, well, hey Dad, it seems like the activity's going down there. Should I come on down where you're at or stay up here? So he had said, well, hey, if you want to go and come on down, you can come down, I'll leave my stand, down here. And so I said, okay, I'm going to get down because, all the information I had from looking at terrain features and putting my cameras out and, spending a lot of summer scouting. And I said, that was the spot I originally, wanted to be. So I said, okay, let's move down there. So I moved down, made my way down the ridge to the lake. Came out to the lake, and it's just cool. I pop out to the lake and look down. And there's my dad. You see his orange sticking out, clear as day, looking down the lake. And so I come on down, meet up with him, see his buck. Nice 7-point buck. And so of course you give congratulations. And he said, well, hey, I'm gonna go back to the cabin. He goes, and I'm gonna grab a canoe. So instead of dragging it out of the woods, it's easier. I can just come along the edge of the lake and grab it with a canoe. I'm like, all right, cool. And he's like, well, I'll show you where the stand is. So we go ahead, and he takes me up in and shows me, where the stand was, and it's a nice, hardwood area. And so I'm like, all right, so yeah, this definitely looks like a good spot and someplace I wanted to set up. And there was a scrape that was probably 20 yards away from where the stand was. You could almost see like an old trail that kind of came down through the woods in that area. which looked like, a good kind of travel area for the deer to come through. And he had said the buck that he had shot that morning was coming down, looked like it was going to drop down to that little kind of old road that was grown up in the hardwoods. So I end up, this is now around 10 o'clock. I end up, going up in the stand, and, he takes off to go, get his buck, and, go back to the camp and grab the canoe. So he takes off. I'm sitting there and the wind's just whipping. It's coming along the ridge, and the way the stand's facing is the wind's at my back. So I sit there, all day, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock goes by, and I hear him come back, and you can hear that fiberglass noise of the paddle, in the canoe, that this distinct sound. I can hear that across the lake, and I hear him unloading the canoe, and he paddles across, and he ends up loading the buck up, and then he goes back across, and I'm of course texting with him, just kind of giving him crap, saying, "Hey, Dad, you quiet down. You're making all kinds of noise over here." And so he says, "Hey, I'm out. I'm going to go to the tagging station and check in the buck." So I'm sitting there, and of course it's now, the winds seem like it's going to calm down. So I kind of, rest my eyes for a little bit after, sitting all day. And then I said, okay, right before prime time, just, kind of got to get your game face back on, because it's been windy. I've been staring, just looking, just can't hear anything, just, looking all day long, glassing, waiting to see some movement. Haven't seen any movement yet at all. Haven't seen one deer, all day. So then finally around, it's got to be getting close to, 2:45 now, 2:40, 2:45, the wind all of a sudden calms down. I'm like, all right, this is, getting into prime time right now. The wind's dying down. If anything's going to get up on his feet, this is probably should be when it'll happen.
Right.
Well, I can go and look down probably about 80 yards, and it's this, to kind of, I guess, describe the woods. It's hardwoods, but it's a mix of beech, some oaks, and there's a lot of yellow and white birch that's mixed in. So there's a lot of branches everywhere. So it's one of those, you can see through it, but to actually, pull up, the muzzle loader and be able to, get a shot off, there's not many, windows or opportunities.
Right.
So I'm just, scanning around through all this, looking pretty high up in the tree. It's a pretty steep elevation that comes down off. And so I'm sitting there and, okay, yep, all right, wind's died down. I look off to my left, and all of a sudden I look up, whoa, there's a deer up there. It's about, 120, 25 yards off, and whoa, it looks like it could be a good one. And so it's off to my left, like real hard, almost back behind me, off to my left. So I grab the gun and I pull around and, pull up the scope to get a better look at it. And as soon as I start to pull up the scope, I can see its head turn. I'm like, oh, it has a big rack on it. I mean, you can just see, tines that go up above its head. And at 125 yards, when you see, a rack that big that stands out like that, it's probably a shooter, especially up there because of, the size of the bodies. If you see a rack that big, it's not like you have to wonder, is it a 2.5-year-old deer? I mean, it's just, they don't have, the nutrition necessarily to produce large racks, unless they have a little bit of age to them and usually some body size to match. So when I saw that, I'm like, okay, now I'm getting excited, and of course, you get the heart racing a little bit. Mm-hmm. Luckily, I've had some experience with getting, some real nice bucks. So this isn't, a new situation, for me, but it always gets that adrenaline pumping. For so sure. It's, the heart's racing. I see the buck. He's angling like he's going to go down towards the lake and start walking kind of further away and almost go out of sight. So I'm debating, do I grab the grunt call? Do I grab, like a tan call? Like, should I do something? Should I turn him, or should I just wait? And I'm like, but if he takes a couple of steps, he's gonna be out of sight. And I got the muzzle loader, and I'm like, there's just no real windows over there necessarily to get a good, true ethical shot. I'm like, I could probably get one through over there, but what is he gonna do? So I just decided I'm just going to wait, see what happens. If he goes out of sight, maybe I can call him back in. The wind's blowing towards me, so I don't have to worry about getting winded. At that point, he turns and starts coming kind of down in my direction. There's a big rock, probably about 60 yards off to my left. And so you're talking a huge boulder. Like the size of probably 5-6 pickup trucks. Wow. And he's angling right towards this big boulder. And he's coming now down towards it. I'm thinking, wow, like he's going to go behind that rock. He's either going to come around it to the left, and I don't know if I'm going to have a shot there, or he's going to come around the right. He's going to be coming right on a string, right down towards me. And at this point, he's getting bigger as he's coming along. I mean, right. I'm not staring at the rack. I'm sizing up the body too, being like, all right, I know it's a buck that I want to shoot. I mean, it's the last week, but in the back of my mind, that goal comes up of 200 pounds. It's like, I still have the rest of the week, though. It's like, this is what you come up here for, and I want more than anything to make sure it's over 200 pounds. And, it's like the late season, so it's got to be a big deer. And I'm looking at it, he comes down through, and you can just, see that, that deep chest, as he comes down, that lumbering, the swaying of the legs as he's walking towards that rock. And he said, he's got to, they got to see him broadside. So he goes down, he goes behind that big boulder. All right, he's going to come out left or right. All of a sudden, you see the tips of the tines start coming out to the right side of the rock. He's creeping his way along that rock. He comes out to the right side, and instead of walking still parallel, along the ridge, about probably actually 70, 80 yards off, he instead turns and starts wrapping around the rock to come right down towards me. And I'm at this point, okay, so waiting for a window and seeing what he's going to do. But I'm like, all right, he's going to keep coming. He's probably going to walk almost right under the stand. Just wait. You don't have to rush. So all of a sudden he stops dead in his tracks, head to the ground, rack right in the leaves. And he's smelling something in the ground. I'm thinking, whoa, what is he smelling? He doesn't seem alarmed. He doesn't seem alert, but his head's right down. I'm thinking, well, where did my dad shoot his deer? Is he smelling that? Did my dad walk over there? Is he smelling my dad? Like, what's going on? And a lot of times human smells up there, it doesn't always spook deer. I mean, sometimes, they'll jump, a mile away. It's like just because of the thermal, and they'll blow and run off. But other times they can smell you, but because they're not as used to people, they don't really associate it always with danger. So it's a little different up there. So I don't know what he's going to do. I've taken the safety off and put it back on, probably 3 or 4 times now. I'm like, he's there at 70 yards. His head's completely straight down. And I'm like, I have a window. There's one branch, and I've turned the scope up to I have a 3x9 by 40 millimeter Leopold VX2 on my muzzle loader. And I have it's a night muzzle loader, and I'm looking through the scope, and I just see this one branch, kind of like a pendulum, back and forth, just swaying slowly through the scope picture. And I'm like, should I take this shot? I'm like, with a 50 caliber muzzle loader, if I hit him right between the shoulder blades at the base of the neck, he's not going anywhere.
Right. I'm
like, it's definitely going to go and put him down. But I'm like, he's going to come closer. And so I, kept debating. It's that, what seems like an eternity. And the whole time I'm thinking, man, it's like he's got to be close. It's like he's got to be right about there at 200 pounds. So at that point, I just, that split-second decision in your head, it just, okay, shoot. Like, he's there, that branch is coming, he could bolt at any second. So then I just, squeeze that trigger, and he just goes down, rack down in the dirt. He almost, his hind legs start to just work one last time. His rear end flips kind of up in the air, and he, instead of doing like a complete cartwheel over, he just started to kind of slide sideways down the hill, and I'm looking, and I'm like, he's down. Like, he's done. Little tail flick, little leg quiver, but quick, just the way you want it.
Nice. Perfect.
He's down. And I'm there, it's like, here you are miles away from the next person. And it's like, you just want to, just give that big old, just almost primal kind of yell, like, hey, I did it, fist pump.
Right.
And of course, the first thing I can just think is, wow, I got to get down and see how big he is. And I'm like, I'm like, I got to text my dad. So I text him BBD. Well, of course, my dad, I don't even know if he has service. And of course, we all know what BBD means, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm sitting there, and my dad, I'm waiting. Finally, okay, boom. He texts back, huh? Question mark. What? And I'm like, big buck down! Exclamation point.
Nice.
And so of course his reply is, there's an expletive. Yeah.
Right.
He's pretty excited. He goes, I'll be there in 30 minutes. And I said, is the canoe still on the back of the truck? And of course he's like, I don't hear back about the canoe. But I'm assuming, he has the canoe still, because he's on his way back from the tagging station. So at this point, I text a couple other buddies. I climb down, and I walk over to him. The first thing I see is the way he's laid. He's stretched right out. I'm like, he has the length, he has the size. His neck is just swelled up, huge. Pick up the rack. Count the points. 11. Basically a 5x5 with a kicker coming off. I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was G3. I think it was. I don't know if it was the G. Maybe it was the G2. And I don't know if you could probably what would you guess the inches are, Clint, from seeing the pictures? I don't even know how to really do inches, but just to kind of put it in perspective.
I can't recall 100%. I would I mean, he's definitely Pope and young. In my book, I mean, he's over 125 inches, probably 130s, maybe pushing 140 would be my guess. And that's just me going.
Yeah, I mean,
going off of memory. I mean, he had some mass. He had great tine length. He had great main beam. He was just a great looking deer.
Yeah, so he wasn't like super wide, but yeah, I mean, that's what I was kind of thinking, around 140, so somewhere in that range. So nice rack, just thick, heavy, and so I'm looking at that and I'm picking it up, looking at it, and so then I said, okay, let's give him the true test. And I don't know if this is even a thought that crosses your guys' head, but grab a hold of that rack. Let's see how he moves. Let's see how heavy this body really feels, and just give him a little tug. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of pull him like, he has that rutted out feel, like he's big bodied, long, huge front end, but he just doesn't seem to have that immovable object type feel.
Right.
And I'm like, it's going to be close, but he's got to be. This has finally got to be the one, like that goes over 200 pounds.
Right. So your dad. So did your dad make his way back with the truck?
So at this point, I walk down the lake. I carry my gear out, and I come out to there's a road a little camp road that goes out to the point. And so I come up to that road and make my way up to it. And sure enough, I just see my dad pull up the truck, put it in park, and I see him look down on the steering wheel to text me and say, I'm here. And as soon as he sends the text, my phone goes off, I get it. And then he looks up and sees me standing in the road, and the arms go up in the air, just give that fist pump. He gets out of the truck, and he's just ecstatic. Come up, we celebrate, high five, hug. It's just that moment, father and son, that you just, that just makes the hunting all worth it. Yeah. And at that point in time, it's okay. It's time to go get him. We bring the canoe down to the lake. Hop in the canoe, and here we are putting the life jackets on. To this point, the lake is freezing cold.
Right.
So you don't want to risk falling. So we put the life jackets on. We paddle across the lake. At this point, it's just before dark. So we go across the lake and go get the buck and look at it. And of course, my dad, he was thinking, he probably goes, we were both thinking, maybe 210, 220 at the absolute most, but probably, around 210-ish.
Right.
I was a little worried just because he didn't have that big feel to him, as far as the heaviness. Loaded him in the canoe. My dad walked back to shore, paddled across. So that was just an amazing experience. Same day, same stand, almost the same spot. And, both got to use the canoe. The canoe's already, covered in blood on the inside from my dad's buck, before we even loaded mine in there. So just, amazing experience, amazing memory. And so then we get him back to the truck. It may have had a little celebration at the truck real quick.
There you go.
Yep. So, maybe had to do a quick little cheers over there because, it was another successful season. And, so then basically we go ahead and, drive out to the tagging station. So there's two tagging stations in the area. One had certified scales. So I said, hey, that's where I want to go. So at this point, we've gone, and dressed the deer. So go to the tagging station, get there. They come out and they put it on the scale. It's a digital scale. So as it's hoisting up off the tailgate, I'm looking at that scale, just waiting to see is it going to go over the mark. And you see it, going up through the 180s. The legs are coming up off, the hindquarters. You see it go to the 190s, and it's approaching 200. It goes to 200, and then finally, it goes 201, 202, 203, and settled on 204.
Nice.
So at that point, it was finally, I knew I'd finally done it and could breathe that sigh of relief.
That's awesome, man. And the cool part is that your dad took a deer earlier, and then you took one out of the same stand. Your dad was able to be there with you. That's just a cool story, man. And you get your patch, man. You know what I mean? So, like, all is good with the little cheers, right? You even get to use the canoe, man. Like, how cool is that? Like, I've never got to use a canoe with hauling out a deer. It's something I think I need to do.
You definitely do, because last year I got another buck in New Hampshire with a muzzle loader, and I had to go get that one out of a swamp with a canoe. And it's just a great feeling loading the buck in and just paddling across, looking at him laying in the canoe in front of you. It's a great sense of accomplishment. So you should definitely put that one on the list.
Yeah, for sure. Man, well, congratulations to you and your dad for a killer hunt this year. I do want to be sensitive to your time because I know we've kept you here for just a little over an hour. But before I let you go, man. Is there anywhere that you want to direct people to kind of follow you on, Facebook or Instagram page or anything like that, where people can kind of tag along with you during your hunting seasons and scouting and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, if anyone, wants to just, look me up on Facebook, Neil Pendleton, you can go ahead and find me on Facebook, follow me there. I've started to, try to go ahead and, do more actual, write-ups about, when I have a successful hunt, kind of retelling the story. Cause I think, for all of us as hunters, we love telling deer stories. So to get a chance to, sit down and, spend the time to actually, write it up so people can, relive that story with you and feel like they were there, I think, it's just an awesome part of it. And as much time as we really put into the actual hunt itself, to take times to really enjoy in the memory and, make it last, to sit down, write it up, to relive it and type it all up is something that I've, really started to enjoy.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, dude, I appreciate you coming on. Everyone go out and give Neil a follow. Good follow. Always thoughtful posts from you just about hunting and things in general. I appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll talk beforehand, but have a good holiday and have a great New Year, my man.
Yeah, thanks, and you too, and same to you too, John. It was great talking to you both tonight, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
For sure, man.
Awesome, man. Appreciate it.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. We'd like to thank Neil for joining us, and before we shut this thing down, a quick reminder: be sure to sign up for the Exodus Lift 2 Trail Camera giveaway on our About page via our newsletter. We'll, as I mentioned in the upfront of this, we'll do a drawing once we hit the 200 mark and get that out to the lucky winner to get into the timber. Also, be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram if you aren't already, and leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes. We'd be very much appreciative of your comments and reviews in that regard. And last but not least, we want to thank all of you for listening, and finally need to give a big shout out to our partners that continue to help make this podcast possible: Wicked Tree Gear, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Whitetail Institute of North America, and Glacier Coolers. And until next time, Happy New Year, and we'll see y'all.
I ain't welcome anymore. Long time coming, if it all. It takes a special knowing to colorful. Damaged heads, broken letters. Rationalize yourself in numbers, but I